All right, thanks everybody for joining tonight. This is, I think we're going to be running just one more coach webinar that I'll probably announce late next week. So thanks for those of you that have been tuning in. I think we'll have a few more join us. So I'll just watch the, I have about 40 registered, so we're hopefully going to have some more joining in with us. Some of you may have been with us last week. We had Tracy talk to our athletes last week, which was really great. Had some decent questions and participation. But why we thought this is such an important topic, mental health in our young athletes, I think all of us can resonate with the fact that this last little while especially has been challenging. But as Tracy will go through tonight, it was a problem before COVID. So the more we can arm ourselves with some strategies and tactics to help our young athletes succeed, that's sort of the topic of tonight. So I did post today on social media one of Tracy's most recent Twitter posts, which I thought was really interesting. She may talk about it today. But she has definitely been in the forefront of battling to get schools reopened during the pandemic, and how important that is for kids and socialization, and making sure that we raise and develop healthy kids. Staying in school is a big part of it. And as well as all the work you guys do as coaches, it's also really important. So Tracy, Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt is a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in School-Based Mental Health and Violence Prevention at the University of Ottawa, where she's cross-appointed as a full professor in counseling, psychology, faculty of education, and the School of Psychology, faculty of social sciences. She's got a ton of academic appointments and awards to her credit. So we're really lucky to have her here. She's published over 190 peer-reviewed studies, primarily between bullying and mental health. And she's also a coach, which I think makes her a really interesting speaker specifically for us. She's heavily involved in soccer as a National B license and as a coach developer with Canada Soccer. She's also a provincial coach and scout with Ontario Soccer and a member of their technical advisory committee. And something I think I learned prior to last week, but Tracy grew up in Revelstoke. So she's a skier. She was on the ski team out in Revelstoke. So she knows our world and a lot of other sports she also works with. So thanks so much, Tracy, for joining us tonight. Really looking forward to this. And yeah, take it away. And if you haven't renamed yourself, everyone, just feel free to rename yourselves, just so I can give you credit for tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if we could just turn on our camera so I can say hi to all of you and I have an idea who I'm speaking with.
Sure.
And also I'm going to try and make it a little bit more interactive instead of just having you sit there, listen in, so I'm hoping that we can, come back and forth on the slides and have a discussion. Does that sound like a good plan? And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'll send the slide deck over to Robin, so you don't need to worry about what's going on, if you wanted to take notes, because I imagine that's high on your list. So what I'm going to do tonight is just kind of give you a crash course on mental health so that you can recognize it within your athletes. And when it's over here on the extreme end, we're all pretty good at picking it up. But when it's at that subclinical area, we're not as good. And then I'm also going to talk about ways we can help their mental health and new areas. So for example, a lot of times you're probably hearing the same thing about growth mindset and things like that, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about mindset, but in a different way. And just really a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about comes from my dealing with athletes and what I know has worked, but also has evidence to support it. Does that sound like a good plan? And if I jump up and say, yay, it's not because anybody did anything fabulous. I'm sure you will, but Canada is playing Mexico in soccer and they're just behind me on the other screen. And so if something happens, we're all going to have to cheer it on together. Does that sound like a reasonable plan as well? Okay.
I'm sure we've got some soccer fans here. So
we do.
Sure.
I feel it. I feel the soccer, that there's going to be that. Okay. So let's see if we're sharing the right thing, and let's go here to view full screen. Okay, are we looking at resiliency, mental health, and young athletes? Okay.
Yep, we got it.
And then because I've already spoken to your athletes, one of the things I told them was that I had a discussion with them about what I'm going to speak to all of you about. And I'll speak to why that's important a little bit later. So basically, crash course right at the beginning about youth mental health. And if you have any specific questions, feel free to interrupt me or throw it in the chat. I'm really easygoing on that. I don't get too flustered by being interrupted through a presentation. Okay, so we think about mental health along a continuum. And also, to be clear, I'm trained as a child clinical psychologist. I don't do clinical work anymore. I oversee people that are becoming psychologists. So I still have my foot in the clinical world, but I don't see children directly anymore. But I certainly have worked in that area for quite some time. So we talk about this along this spectrum. And a lot of the athletes that you have are along this line. So they may not be over here where they have a bona fide disorder where it's diagnosed. They're subclinical and they're on their way to having a mental disorder. And what differentiates kids who are just along this edge over here where they have emotional problems and concerns or having a mental illness is that they have a lot of distress and or disability. And what we mean by disability is that they don't go to school anymore. They have a hard time attending school. They quit their job. They don't see their friends anymore. They stop attending ski meets and practices and the like. We call it training, right? Ski training, not practices. We have practices. So they don't come to training anymore. And disability in adults looks really easy because you're not keeping a job, you're having difficulties in your romantic or in other interpersonal relationships. But in kids, it's a bit harder to detect that disability. For coaches, what you want to look at is a change from baseline. So is this a kid who consistently shows up to all of the training and all the meets and is enthusiastic and now is apathetic and less interested? Is this an individual who's lost a lot of weight or gained a lot of weight? Because those are indicators of eating disorders and also of depression. Is this an adolescent who used to think well of themselves and now is criticizing themselves constantly? So just think about what you know about their baseline. And that is always the thing that we reference because some kids have an inherently more difficult personality than others, right? Some have a temperament that's even miserable, if I could be so bold. We do have that temperament that exists in society. So just look at what's there and how it's changing. The thing to know, another good clinical indicator is that kids and teens cannot code switch out of a mental disorder. It exists across a variety of contexts and it's entrenched. So if they have a difficulty getting along with their teammates in the context of skiing, but are good at school, there's probably something about the context of their team. With a mental disorder, you see it at home. You see it, in their soccer team. You see it, when they go to their grandmother's house. You see it when they go to school. You see it when they're at their job. So it doesn't exist in one context. Now, some kids are really good at masking it. So they may just be very disruptive or very anxious and sad at home. But they still, even though they're suppressing some of that in front of others, it's still, the veneer is cracked. You'll still see it slip through. And it's funny because I remember seeing this kid years ago, and I diagnosed him with ADHD and other behavioral difficulties. There's this thing called oppositional defiance disorder. And I was asking the parents about the behavior across contexts. And the mother said that their son was just terrible in the minivan. And I love that because that's not what I meant by context, but I'm sure he was not very good in the minivan either. So he wasn't good at home. He wasn't good in the car. He wasn't good with his friends. He wasn't good at school. In Canada, we have 15 to 22% of youth who have serious mental health problems. So 1 in 5 meet diagnostic criteria for mental disorders. So when you think about your squad, when you think about how many athletes you're interacting with, what would be the smallest number in your group? Because I know there's a lot of one-on-one, but you would have what?
Yeah, like 6 to 1 ratio, that sort of thing.
So if you have a 6 to 1 ratio, you have one and a bit in every group that you're seeing. And sometimes they cluster more in some sports than other sports. So you'll see an overrepresentation of adolescents with eating disorders in long distance running compared to other sports. Canada, we fare miserably when it comes to children's mental health. So when you look at UNICEF, where they compare Canada to other economically advanced countries, so the 38 richest countries in the world, we come 30th out of 38 rich countries on overall well-being, and on mental well-being, we come 31st. So that is not something to be proud of. The Netherlands is ranked first, and we're just right at the bottom. And we're consistently at the bottom. So here, UNICEF's been tracking adolescent mental health forever. And here we're looking at data from 2006 to 2010 to 2017. And we look at Canada's lines, and they're all about the same. So what that means is that our rates are not getting better. They're always bad. We have a significant suicide issue. And I don't know if you've ever lost an athlete to suicide, but it is a notable issue. And it's a notable issue among economically advanced countries. So it's the leading cause of death among youth in high income countries. It accounts for about 18% of all deaths. It's a particular problem for boys. Adolescent boys tend to be more externalized when they're depressed, and they also tend to be more impulsive. So they tend to complete suicide more than girls. And it's a particular problem with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit youth. We are concerned about mental health issues because they almost always begin in adolescence and continue into adulthood. So 50 to 75% of mental health disorders began before the age of 15. And I'll just give you one example from a study that I did with my postdoc. So here we followed Canadian kids from grade 5 to grade 12. We assessed their symptoms. So this isn't even a disorder. We assessed their symptoms for social anxiety disorder every year. So, how anxious are they about social situations? And then we use these trajectories. So we're comparing kids who followed a high trajectory of symptoms versus those who followed this low trajectory. And we looked at that in the prediction of adult mental health, adult disorders in particular. What were their disorders? What were they diagnosed with in adulthood? And what we found was these kids who followed this high trajectory were 20 times more likely to be diagnosed with depression in adulthood, 16 times more likely to be diagnosed with social anxiety disorder, 16 times more likely to have agoraphobia, and 13 times more likely to have generalized anxiety disorder. So we need to stop this before it becomes entrenched, before it continues across the lifespan. And it is a notable problem around the world. So mental health problems are the leading cause of disability worldwide. They've actually now, for the past 10 years, they've superseded hypertension. So it used to be cardiovascular problems was the #1 issue in the world, and it's now mental health problems, and in particular depression. And in adults, they account for 14.3% of deaths worldwide. So that means 8 million adults every year in the world die because of mental disorders. We know that it's not a risk that's equally shared. So kids who come from more socioeconomically disadvantaged families are more likely to have mental disorders. So we talked about 1 in 5 Canadian children having mental disorders, but here you see up to 39% for teens who are in low income families. Girls are more affected than boys. Girls are 2 times more likely to be depressed, 2 times more likely to be anxious than boys. And the only exception is with externalizing problems like substance abuse, conduct problems, and autism spectrum disorder. Now, this is a really important part. And this is why we have, the presentation of mental health issues in teens is so different and in children than it is for adults. And it's precisely because they're nested within their family. So they're influenced by their environment, which includes their ski environment more than adults are. So they have very little autonomy for their decisions, especially when they're younger. And this nesting influences how you see the disorder. So it influences their symptom presentation and their level of impairment. So if you have a kid who has an anxiety disorder, so I have a very anxious daughter, and she does fairly well because it just so happens her mom's a child psychologist, right? But that child in a different family who doesn't have the same resources might be like a complete disaster in terms of trying to get her to meet the demands of life. The kicker here is that we have a service gap like there's no other. So can you imagine not having services for, if we had 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 Canadian children having diabetes and we only service 20% of them? And that's what happens with mental health. So most youth don't receive services, and the ones that do are the ones that have like the most severe impairing mental disorders. And it just so happens it tends to be the ones that are externalizing. So if you infringe upon the rights of others, like in your classroom, and you have problems sitting still, and you're always, fiddling, and you're pushing other kids and things like that, and you're shouting, you're going to get to the attention you need. But if you have a internalizing problem like anxiety or depression, you actually are going to suffer in silence, right? Like there's not very many people are going to recognize that you are in trouble. And when you, and because you're not taxing to the system, they're not going to put you at the top of the priority list. The other issue with this is that recent immigrants to Canada are less likely to access mental health issues. So way too many kids have mental health issues. You're going to have at least one in each squad that you're managing that's going to have a mental disorder, and there are not that many services. So before we go to what this looks like during COVID, I just want to ask you, what are you seeing with your skiers? Do you have any specific questions? You might as well just, pick my brain right now.
Any of you guys want to unmute if you've got any questions or comments?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and apologies if there was a call before this, but and some of these terms are known, but some of the ones you highlighted there, some acronyms and so forth, just very high level. Obviously, we've got a short amount of time, but I don't know if I fully understand all the acronyms in terms of what you're describing in terms of some of these nomenclature. So that'll be helpful.
Okay, so for example, ASD, like is that one example, like autism spectrum disorder?
Yeah, I think if you just run through all of them and then just gives a general awareness,
okay.
Right?
So the disorders you're most often going to see, and you have a mixture of children and adolescents, correct? The coaches on this call?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, so when they're younger, you're most likely going to see issues with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and conduct problems like oppositional defiance disorder, and a little bit of anxiety. You'll see a little bit of anxiety coming out in the younger kids. As they get older, all of that externalizing problems where you see their behavior turns inward. And so what you're more likely to see as they become adolescents is problems with depression and anxiety. And so that's going to be the big culprits for you, and eating disorders. And you're going to see more eating disorders with the adolescent girls that you're working with. And especially, it'll be interesting to see, and I haven't seen a lot of work on eating disorders in alpine skiing, but I would imagine that your athletes will be a little bit more at risk because if you're wearing, the downhill suits and stuff, it's so revealing in terms of body that it might make some adolescents more sensitive to that. So does that help, Adam?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Anybody else?
Is there any difference between team sports and individual sports as to the prevalence of mental health disorders? Do younger kids tend to, with any type of these disorders, tend to go towards more individual sports, or is it pretty much equal across the board?
It's pretty equal with some exceptions. So you do tend to see endurance sports. You get more individuals who have eating disorders are more found in those sports, endurance sports. But it's interesting because I see a lot of kids with, there's an overrepresentation just generally of athletes who are very successful with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And when you think about it, a lot of it has to do with managing the, so you have an obsession, this thought, and then you try and deal with it. You reduce your anxiety by doing some behavior. So for example, I've worked with a lot of athletes who think that if they don't get 50 shots, 3 free throws in a row, something bad's going to happen to their family. So they'll spend 3 hours after practice just throwing and throwing and throwing. And as coaches, we think of this and we're like, oh, that looks great. Like this person's really committed. But what we're failing to recognize is that that's aberrant. They're spending way too much time on this one task, and it's related to reducing anxiety. So you will see more OCD in high level sports than you would in any other profession. Okay.
Quick question about adolescence. Why is it that females may develop quicker with both depression and anxiety before males?
So part of the problem, so historically we've thought it had to do with psychosocial stressors because society hasn't been kind to girls and women. In North American culture, though, there have been a lot of progressions in terms of rights of women and rights of girls, and yet it hasn't corresponded with a reduction in depression and anxiety. I think it has to do with social comparisons, and I have a whole section on that, and we're going to get to it. I'm going to show you how girls are more sensitive to social comparisons, which leads to problems with depression and anxiety. Does that sound okay? So if I could just we'll just pause it there for 1 second, and then Dallas will answer your question, and then I'll move on.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, just a quick thing. Also, too, is there more research into, everyone knows about ADHD with boys, but there's never been enough about girls because it is opposite. And what's happening now is a lot of the females are now getting diagnosed into their 40s because it's finally being recognized. Is there more information to recognize it?
So the diagnostic pattern for ADHD is still favoring more boys get diagnosed than girls. But when you think about our age group, we wouldn't have been diagnosed. We would have just been thought of as distracted. Yeah. And then there's also subtypes. They're now specifiers on ADHD. So 80% of kids with ADHD have a combined type where they're inattentive and they're hyperactive. And 20% are either hyperactive or inattentive. And when that happens, girls are usually the subtype of inattentive.
Okay,
so
perfect.
They seem like they're just not paying attention. So
Yeah.
they're not wild and all over the classroom or not paying attention to their instructor, but they are still in trouble. So it's a very good question.
Yeah, because I think there needs to be more information, especially for the male coaches, because you recognize the boys, but the girl stuff is still not recognized.
And when girls do have ADHD and it's that combined type, they're more impaired than boys. Because society doesn't have a lot of tolerance for a really wiry girl.
They mask it.
No, they don't. I'm talking about when they can't mask it.
Oh, yeah.
We can't. Adults don't like girls who behave like that. More so, with boys, you think, it's just boys being boys. With girls, it's like, wow, what are you doing? That's not how girls behave. So stereotypes fit in also to how we diagnose and why.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so since COVID, and this is the thing that everybody's been quite worried about is this getting worse? Is this something that we should be concerned of? I think we've always should have been concerned, but we certainly are, things are getting worse. So it's important to, first of all, recognize that not everybody is suffering. So just because our kids are living through a global pandemic does not mean that they're all going to do poorly. Right? Some are going to do better than others. For example, clinically, kids with a social anxiety disorder, which is where you don't like to speak in class, you feel anxious around others, you don't like attention on you. those kids are doing better during the pandemic than they were before the pandemic because they have the ability to learn on Zoom. Right now, like if they were on this Zoom class, the pressure would be off because they could turn off their camera and just listen in instead of going into class and maybe the teacher's going to call on you, and that's just terrible. The other thing is that kids have differential exposure. So some children, and the thing about alpine skiing is a little bit different from soccer. We have more variability on socioeconomics, but the point just being is that some kids' parents lost their job. Some kids lost their parents because of COVID. Some kids, didn't go to school. Other kids did. Like there's all these things that compound and relate to differential outcomes. So I don't want you to think that everybody that you're coaching is going to be not faring well, because some might be doing okay. I'm going to first start with eating disorders though. Eating disorders are off the map, off the chart right now. So eating disorders have two types. We have anorexia nervosa, which is you're basically starving yourself. And we have bulimia nervosa, which is where you binge and then you purge. And you can purge by throwing up, by using laxatives. You can purge by exercising a lot. So across Canada, the hospitals across Canada, the children's hospitals have experienced a 60% increase in admissions for eating disorders. The 5 hospitals, children's hospitals in Ontario, are 223% above capacity as of June 2021. In Australia, they're noticing the same thing, 104% increase in admissions now versus before the pandemic. So my question to all of you, because think about this from the athlete's perspective, because this is a really good way for us to think about mental health, is why do you think that eating disorders, so when we look at all mental health disorders, eating disorders is the one that has exploded the most during COVID? What do you think's going on? I'll stop sharing just so I could see all of you.
Kids aren't getting a chance to exercise as much as they used to. So
okay, so exactly. So one of the things is that we shut down their ability to exercise, right? So a lot of kids with eating disorder are like their compensatory behavior, the way they're managing their weight is through sport. And that's something that we don't address enough as coaches. So we took away their ability to run for some, like in, if they were in a track group, or we shut down the gyms, we didn't let them go to soccer, they didn't go skiing with all of you. What might be another reason that we're seeing explosions on eating disorders?
Talking about eating disorders, we tend to focus more on abstention from eating food or purging, but would binge eating also be?
It's actually the most common form of eating disorder.
Because I think there's a lot of boredom, a lot of
exactly.
Idleness.
It's a coping mechanism. It's a coping mechanism. Can you think of another thing? So eating disorders are really sensitive to the environment. So what society says about things, what society says about what kids, like how women are supposed to look and how girls are supposed to look. What are people saying about COVID and weight? Like COVID fat, right? Like COVID-19 means COVID, is that what you were going to say?
Negative. I wasn't going to say that. You were just talking about image and such. And I think there's more time than ever to spend on social media these days. And what I think we should all learn about social media is that it's probably all fake.
Okay, so that's another reason. So, okay, so we took away their ability to exercise, right? They're making more social comparisons than they ever have because they're on social media. Everybody's saying that people are gaining weight during COVID because they're not exercising as much and they're more on screens. And then the final thing is that eating disorders are really about control.
Yeah, I was going to say it's control. Yeah.
All of their control. So of course this is going to explode. But it actually is unearthing this little secret, this dirty little secret that we have, where we pretend, we ignore that some of the hyper commitment we see to our sport is actually an eating disorder or it's obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay. Good stuff. So I'm going to share this again. I'm going to come over here so I can see my slides. Okay. So that's eating, but anxiety and depression has also increased. So longitudinal studies where we measured it before the pandemic and we're measuring it during the pandemic show that there's also an increase in anxiety and depression symptoms. And a big study that put all of the studies together to create a summary statistic. So it's called a meta-analysis. They found that 1 in 4 youth are now experiencing clinically elevated depression symptoms, and 1 in 5 youth are experiencing clinically elevated anxiety symptoms. So we couldn't keep up with this before the pandemic. And now all of our hospitals and clinicians are devoted toward what? Managing ICUs and COVID patients. And now we have a mental health explosion, right? So we had a crisis before, and now it's reached a fever pitch that we can't manage. The other thing too is that all of the studies are kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, and we don't really have, we're just starting to get the information about what's happening now. So at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of kids had hope, right? They hoped that it was only going to be 6 months. I, in my mind, thought it was going to be 2 years. I was thinking about the pandemic of 1918. I thought 2 years would probably make a reasonable assumption. And now we're on another variant that might be problematic. You know, kids are worried about schools shutting down and the like. And so we need to reassess this as time goes by. Okay, so that's the current state of affairs. You have a lot of youth that you're working with who have significant mental health issues. Okay, good luck. I got to go now. I'm going to be here and I'm going to help you out a bit. Okay, so what can we do to help? So first of all, we need to work on their resilience. One of the things about resilience is that everybody thinks they know what it is, and everybody thinks that kids have it in abundance, and it's not true. So resilience just means that you've successfully adapted to a very risky or adverse environment. So in Sweden, they call these kids dandelion kids because a dandelion can grow anywhere. It can grow through the crack in your cement, right? In your driveway, much to your frustration. So we have this perception, this misperception that kids are inherently resilient. And if you hold that perception and they're not resilient, then in a sense, you're adding another layer of why, like, you failed because it's you, it's on you, because this is something that should just be easy for you. But kids are not inherently resilient. It's like a teeter-totter, right? It depends how many stressors they have and how many coping mechanisms they have. And if they have more stressors than they have coping mechanisms, things aren't going to go well for them. So we're always trying to rebalance it. And as coaches, we play a really important role in rebalancing that. So we know that there are 3 main categories that promote resilience in kids in adolescence. And the first thing has to do with all of you. I can't estimate this enough. The most consistent asset of resilient kids is a strong bond with a competent adult, and it tends to be a teacher or a coach. So the role you play in kids' lives is enormous. It's not their parent, it's their coach or their teacher. We know that a caring relationship with you motivates athletes to succeed, and it's what keeps them coming back. So you play a role that is often dismissed in society. We don't give enough credit to coaches of adolescents and children. But if you did what I did and you were a child psychologist, you would know that you play such an important role. We know from the research that the most important thing you can do is have high expectations with caring relationships. You can't have no standard. You have to have a standard. And that standard has to be met with kindness and compassion. So coaches who are autocratic and only have a standard, their athletes don't do well. And coaches who are all like sweet and no standard, their athletes don't do well. The athletes who do well are the ones who have coaches who tell you the truth, who have an expectation for you, and who also do it with kindness and compassion. So structure and support is what you're aiming for. So I find, though, it's really hard to coach in today's environment. And so a lot of times we don't want to have the tough discussion with our athletes because we're worried about their self-esteem. We're worried about their parents getting on our case about it. But you're not a good coach if you're not providing structure. Any questions about this? Okay, straightforward. Okay, I'm going to move on. The other thing that a lot of times coaches under-recognize, but if you think back to being in high school and elementary school, is that peer relationships are really important for resiliency, especially in teenagers. And what we tend to do is we tend to ignore this part of their lives in the context of our sport. So we're so busy managing their success, their athletic success, that we fail to recognize that they need to belong. So this is so important. So if you're dealing with 6 athletes, we want those 6 athletes to get along. We want them to feel like they matter to each other. And so I have done the bulk of my work on this model, and I'll explain it really simply. When you have poor interpersonal relationships, when you go to ski, to your ski meet or to your ski training, and you think your coach doesn't like you or that your teammates don't like you, that causes stress. And that stress is managed with your stress response system, which is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The end result of that stress response is cortisol. And I'm sure you've all heard about cortisol. So cortisol is your stress hormone. You don't want a lot of it, but you don't want a little bit of it either. Too much cortisol, too much activation of this stress response system impairs your memory and your learning and your ability then to perform. Because what it does is it, in a sense, kills areas like the receptor sites in your brain for cortisol. It damages them to the point where new learning doesn't take place. The retention of material doesn't take place. So what I can also do, Robin, is send you a paper where I outline this in the context of sports performance. And I show that this sequence right at the beginning leads to this cascade where your athletes are more depressed, more anxious, and they're not performing as well. So it's really important that they get along. It's really important because we can realize that if they feel bullied at their ski, in their ski environment, that they're probably going to be depressed and anxious. But also I want you to know that there's a biological mechanism of why that is. And I'm going to give you one example. So in this study, they looked at the effects of being bullied in childhood and how it impacts inflammation in adulthood. And you know you don't want inflammation. You're all coaches. You know that inflammation is bad for athletes. Here, individuals who were bullied as kids had higher inflammation rates when they were adults. So this need to belong stuck with them all the way into adulthood. And the reason being is that belonging is a fundamental human motivator. So we have a biological need to belong. And what really pisses me off is that our Ontario government shut down everything on kids for far too long. So they thwarted this fundamental need to belong. They created social deprivation, which is just now a natural experiment on what not to do. So I wrote this op-ed about physical activity, and it got taken up by almost every organization, sport organization in Canada, and recirculated. And basically I said was, shame on all of you. Shame on you for shutting down Alpine Ontario. Shame on you for closing down Ontario soccer, because kids need to belong. So we took away their schooling. We said, no, you can't go to school. We took away all their sports and said, no, you can't do any of your sports. And then we wonder why their depression and anxiety rates went up. We socially isolated them when their need to belong is something that's fundamental to being human. And it's interesting because this thing came out in the Global Mail and it said thousands of Canadian girls not committed to playing sports post-COVID, so study finds. Like, pardon my language, but no shit, right? Like, they were already on the cusp of not staying in, and then you just took it away from them, and then you expect them to come back. And I especially feel for the Alpine athletes because it's such a technical sport. I can imagine, and Robin, you know, at some point you'll have to get me your attrition values. I'd love to see what happened and how. I bet you it was related to age too. I bet you your adolescent girls around 14 and 15 probably weren't as motivated to come back after sitting out for a year. Okay, so you have to have appropriate relationships with them. You have to be caring, but you have to have structure. And then we also have to work on their mindset. So as adults, we can reorganize the way they see the world. And that's what we do all the time. It's called social referencing. So my daughter, who's a little anxious, when she says something, if I was an anxious mom, I would just reinforce that anxiety by saying, you're probably right. You probably did fail that test. But when she's worried about failure on a test, I say things like, where's the evidence? You studied, you always do well, and I reframe it. And that's what adults do. We act as the prefrontal cortex for kids. When they're upset, they use the wrong part of their brain, and they need adults like us, the coaches, to have them use the right part of their brain. So in the last 15 minutes, the way a person perceives the environment can absolutely influence their performance. And this is where I say the three big things are that are affecting performance in athletes along with their mental health. The wrong type of competitiveness, which leads to too many social comparisons, perfectionism, and intolerance for discomfort. And I'll deal with them each in turn. So competitiveness is good. It's a trait that promotes productivity, prosperity, innovation. So your more competitive athletes are probably the ones that are hitting the podium more often. But there's a dark side to competitiveness. If you're too competitive, if you're always about winning at all costs, it's a zero-sum game, you're more likely to have problems with depression and anxiety, and you're more likely to self-harm. You're also less likely to get along with people. People don't like people who are competitive across all contexts. So it leads to more conflict and more aggression, and it leads to less closeness with peers. There's two types of competitiveness, and this is something you need to know as a coach. There's personal development competitiveness, which is competing to excel. So I compare myself to myself. Last week, I came 28th in the race. I'm striving to hit top 15. This is good. It's a focus on individual accomplishments and self-improvement. Hyper-competitiveness is not. This is competing to win at all costs. You need to win and outperform others. And the only way you're happy is if you beat others. The problem is that you can't always beat others. So it leads to a lot of problems with, again, interpersonal relations and with mental health issues. And the reason being is because hyper-competitive people tend to make too many upward social comparisons. They make comparisons to the person who won, and that causes them jealousy. And they deal with that jealousy with poor coping strategies. Either they tear down the person and say, oh, they only won because, you know, they're the coach's favorite, or they only won because whatever, right? Or they internalize it and say, I'm never going to be good enough. They either win or they lose. So we really, really need to work on this hyper-competitiveness. Now, this is a huge graph, all this to say that there was a study by me and my postdoc to show that this is actually the truth. But the kicker, girls do it more than boys. So it comes back to, I think it was Louis' point about social comparisons and being on social media a lot. So what happens is they look at something like, she's prettier than me, has more friends than me, that sort of thing. And that elicits a reaction. And that reaction tends to be negative, jealousy, which then gets fixed by either being aggressive against the target or coming back and saying, I'm never going to be good enough. So this is something that we need to work on. And the way we work on it is we manage their social comparisons. So when they start saying things like, I'm never going to be as good as Ashley, or I'm never going to be as good as Jed, we say, but that's not our focus. Our focus is not on the outcome. Our focus is on the process. You're better than you were last year. You're working towards being better this year. So we focus on competing to excel, focus on having them compete with themselves. The other thing is that we have to have them avoid their dichotomous thinking, because hyper-competitive kids think if they didn't win, they're losers. And that isn't good enough. So we need them to think about, no, it's not about the end process. It's not always about meeting this podium, because they're going to get to the podium eventually if they keep the course, if they keep working hard. Because development is not linear. It is such a messy process. And you all know that. You all know that there's the kids who are good today, but won't be on your World Cup circuit tomorrow. And there's those that are going to eventually make it to the World Cup circuit. And they're very, very different. And I'll give an example from my daughter. So this is my daughter, Molly Erickson. And if you're a soccer coach, you know that this is terrible form. Like, it's horrible. It really is. First of all, the grass is terrible too. But this kid should probably just like put the cleats off and sit on the bench and like pass out the orange slices. It's that bad. Okay. So this is when Molly's 8. It's horrible. But Molly kept at it. And now Molly's on the national team and she's on a full ride at a D1 school, the starting keeper. So the point here is that Molly's trajectory did like this. Sometimes she was good and sometimes she was bad. But eventually she got there because what we worked on was the process and not the outcome. And eventually the outcome came. Okay. The other thing that I see all the time is perfectionism in high striving athletes. And it's a maladaptive personality style where you have really high standards, self-imposed, and you evaluate yourself on the ability to meet those high standards. And I love this graphic because it's like, feel like you could be doing more, do more, and you can never get out of this loop. So kids who are perfectionistic, a lot of times will say this like it's a badge of honor, right? Like, oh, I'm so perfectionistic, like, ha, ha, ha. But it's not good. There's nothing good about perfectionism. When it is portrayed as being positive, it's just because it's confused with conscientiousness. So I study perfectionism a lot. It's related to eating disorders. It's related to depression. It's related to anxiety. It's related to burnout. Perfectionistic kids and adolescents don't thrive in the end. They're miserable. And the reason comes back again to this thinking. Like the hyper-competitive kids, they tend to be all or none in their thinking. So they make polarized assumptions about events. If they didn't do well in this race, it means they're never going to do well again, right? If they fell on the GS race, it means they're going to fall again in the future. But when they succeed, they don't give themselves the benefit that they're always going to succeed. They take their failures to heart and they overinterpret how it's going to come. So they overgeneralize it and they make it so black and white. And they also assume responsibility for events outside of their control. As we all know, like you're probably all ex-athletes, there's a little bit of luck in it. We don't want to say it, but there is some luck in it, right? Sometimes the wind picked up just when you're coming down in the right way. And sometimes the rut is so big, you're coming around that gate and because you're coming down late and it's not going to favor you. Sometimes there are things outside of your control. So what we need to do then with perfectionistic thinking is again, change our athletes' thinking. So when they get into this all or none thinking, we say, no, there's no evidence that you're always going to fall. There's no evidence that you're always going to be a failure on this. And you always reframe it for them. You get them to accept that achieving perfection is never going to be possible. And you get them to understand the messiness of being an athlete. That sometimes you're up and sometimes you're down, but what is your end goal? Your end goal is to accomplish this by the time you're 25 or whatever. We have to be able to tolerate this. They need to understand that everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and that's what makes us human. The other thing that we need to get them to work on is to be more compassionate to themselves, and they're not. They need to understand that they're young and they're still working on their goals, and we do not expect them to be perfect, ever be perfect. We expect that they're going to have some ups and some downs, and that's just how it is. So we got to avoid that all or nothing thinking, and we have to make sure we don't impose that on them as well, where the standard is either met or it's not. And we need to keep reminding them that perfection, not attaining the standard does not mean that you're a failure. And the final thing I want to talk about is what I find so challenging as a coach today. And this is what I see in parents and I see in their kids more than I've ever seen in my life. And it's an intolerance for discomfort. So when I first started teaching 20 years ago at the university, I didn't have parents contact me ever. My parents never once went to see the teacher, right? Like the teacher could have like punched me and then offered me a cigarette as a sorry, and my parents wouldn't have come over. They wouldn't have said anything. It just wouldn't have happened. And today, you know, your fifth grader gets a B on the exam and you want to get the teacher fired. Your son came 28th in the race and you want to get the coach fired because how could this have happened, right? So there is this intolerance for discomfort in parents that I've never seen before. They're trying to insulate their kid so that there's no failure. And as a consequence, there's also an intolerance for discomfort for their kids. So if their kid doesn't start, they cry on the bench and then they cry in the car. And then their parents get on my case and say, you destroyed her self-esteem. Did you not know you played her 6 minutes less than everybody else? And it was so humiliating for her, right? But we see this from parent to kid. And remember, they're nested within each other. The problem with all of this insulation from distress and discomfort is it actually increases anxiety in the future. It leads all these accommodations lead to more severe symptoms of anxiety, more impairment, and poor treatment outcomes. So as coaches, we need to be able to tell them, remember structure and support. 2 + 2 does not equal 5, and you cannot convince me that it does. There's nothing wrong in saying that this is the technique and this is how we do it. But together, collectively, we need to have each other's back, and your administrators need to have your back, because there is a proper way, there is a proper technique, there is a technique of skiing that will improve their speed. And that's not unkind to say it, but you can also say it with compassion and say, I expect that, you know, you're not going to get it right away. I expect that we're going to work on this, that sort of thing. Kids and parents need to understand that failure is part of life, and so is stress. And if we keep insulating these kids, I don't even know how they're going to parent their kids. It's going to be a disaster. They need to learn how to deal with adversity and obstacles. But we can help them with their reset on their thinking, right? But we also have to be telling them the truth. So I'm going to ask you to carry your athletes into excellent, but that doesn't mean that we gaslight them, that we tell them things that aren't true. I tweeted this the other day, and I'm going to get over my perfectionism here, which is maladaptive, because I have one little typo, but it did very well. And I said, we need to be transparent. So I said that predictability reduces anxiety in youth. And I know that for a fact. So if you tell them what your expectations are, they will be less anxious. If you communicate clearly with your athletes about what your expectations are and your decision making, and I don't mean the minutia of everything, like why are we wearing the red pennies today? I mean the big decisions. I took you off because this is what I saw. You're not starting today because I didn't think your effort at practice was good, right? You're not traveling with the ski team for this meet because, not like because we didn't have enough room for you, I just need you to try harder. Be honest with them. Being transparent is kind. It improves the trust, it reduces their stress, and it also promotes learning. Okay, so I'm happy to have a discussion now if you want. We don't have much time. We have 6 minutes, but it's going to be 4 glorious minutes.
How's the soccer game going?
0-0.
Okay, you're good then. Good.
At the half.
Who's got some questions? Anyone have any questions for Tracy?
And the question can't be, how can you speak this fast?
Yeah, you've done this before, I can tell.
No, but I always speak fast. I get anxious, so you got to speed it up.
It's a
So
teacher
any
in you.
questions? Did you get anything from it, or was it just too much information? Go ahead, Dallas, please.
Okay, sorry for bumping in again. One of the things I think is you're saying the anxiety and depression has gone up so much, but I also think that the stigma and the communication and the knowledge about it is actually a lot better. So I don't think it's necessary. Well, obviously it's gone up for pandemic, many reasons, but I sort of don't want everyone to blame the pandemic on depression, where I think now you can actually talk about it. Lots of people have all those issues, and obviously they didn't know what PTSD was, with, you know, people coming back from the wars and everything. What's your take on that? That's just my
So I think that when you look at why people get diagnosed and why they come into your office, of course that when you reduce stigma, you increase help seeking. But these are pretty modern studies that I'm presenting. So that stigma would have been the reduction in stigma would have been in the past decade, and we're still seeing really high rates. Now, our rates, if we compared them to 1940s, would look very different. They would look really high. But I'm not comparing 1940 to 2021. It's a very fair point, though. So, for example, if you have narcissistic personality disorder, you're not going to come and see me because you don't think there's any problem. You think you're the best, right? So why would you ever need to see a clinician? So you do have an increase when you increase awareness, you increase identification. But it doesn't account for the amount of rates that we have. Even with that increase in identification, let's say we give it 4 percentage points, we still have far too many kids with mental health issues. And we are increasing it during the pandemic, but not for all. Like, that's why I started with some kids are doing better, right? But I can't expect us to take away everything that we did in Ontario and our kids to do better. So I've been arguing for the better part of 2 years to say, don't close schools, don't ever do them again. We wrote a letter to the government. It went viral. It was in the newspaper and everything. I've been trolled and told to die already a million times over this because some parents didn't want their kids back at school. But I'm making a decision based on what the evidence tells me. And the evidence tells me that kids need to be with kids, teens need to be with teens. And our kids and our teens need to be with good coaches like all of you, because you don't know what's going on in their home, right? You're not privileged to knowing. So the best environment is a controlled environment in a lot of ways. If things aren't going well at home, then at least we can take care of them when they're in our ski environment. But very fair question, Dallas.
Maybe more than a comment than a question. I 100% agree with you with the fact that children, especially with if you gain their trust, will open up to you. I get it all the time with parents that kids will share things with me just during their weekly things, not anything deep or anything. Just ask them how their week went instead of being so specific on your daily task or what they were doing. And they open up to you. When they do that, I feel like I'm just reiterating exactly kind of what you said, mind you.
But I like that though, because that's what we know. Like, if you invest in their life, and I'm not saying be intrusive, like, oh, how are your symptoms of anxiety today? But more like, okay, if you notice, let's say Tracy comes to this, comes to see you and I got a haircut and you don't notice it, like, like those little things mean a lot to individuals. I always talk about my daughter, Molly, who had the worst black eye ever because she's a goalkeeper, right, in soccer. And she kept telling me that her religion teacher didn't like her in grade 7. And I'm doing my reframing. Where's the evidence? Like, of course she likes you. What's not to like? You're such a likable kid. I'm sure you've got that wrong, right? I'm sure she likes you. So Molly had this shiner, shows up at school. All the teachers ask her how she's doing, as they should for due diligence. And the only person that didn't even acknowledge her black eye was her religion teacher. And I thought, you probably got it right. But we know that when we notice these little things in kids, like checking in on them on little things, they're more likely then to come to you with the big things. So very good. That's what we should be doing, right?
I kind of stole it from a Colin Morikawa video where he was talking to Tiger Woods and he was talking about coaching. And he said, didn't matter who my coach was, I was always going to be best in the world because I wanted to be best in the world. All I needed from my coach was to believe in me. And I really
Yeah.
took that away.
And sometimes though, I find, and I'm not saying this in reference to Tiger Woods per se, but a lot of times we put too much meaning on these athletes that are exceptional, and they truly are exceptional, because being Tiger Woods means you're 0.0000001%, right? So most of the athletes that you're working with and that I'm working with, I get to work with high performance athletes, and I think you all are too, end up doing very well. They're playing in this game. I have 4 players that are currently on the field that I've coached. But when I coach club soccer, most of them were not going to be there. And so we have to keep in mind, what is it that we're trying to promote through sport? I see a question here. Any tips for overcoming self-consciousness for helping athletes overcome it? Well, that self-consciousness is really interesting because it's actually linked to anxiety as well. And one thing that is really hard for adolescents in particular is they have this thing called adolescent egocentrism, which has 2 components. It has the component where they think everybody is interested in them, but nobody really is, and that their perspective is more unique. So not only is it the biggest zit that's ever existed in the world, but everybody is looking at it. The problem is that because they're so egocentric, they don't realize that everybody else has this worry too. So I think just telling kids that, and it kind of is a bit dismissive, but saying, I can appreciate that you're worried about these things, but all teenagers are struggling with the same thing. They're all worried about how people see them. I think we're running out of time, right, Robin? But I'm happy to hear from any of you. I'll just quickly put my email address here. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. And Robin, if anything comes up, I'm happy to address it with you, with your group.